Wound healing, the basics on the cellular and biochemical levels. The proliferative phase, part 4, epithelialization. In the previous lessons on proliferative phase, we spoke about many processes that are ongoing simultaneously. The processes of angiogenesis and granulation tissue formation and collagen deposition were discussed. In this lesson, epithelialization will be discussed. So let's begin with the anatomy of the skin. The outer layer of skin is called the epidermis. It consists of epithelial cells that rest upon a basement membrane, which is irregular in shape. Below the basement membrane is the dermis. The dermis close to the basement membrane is the papillary dermis. The deeper layer of the dermis is called the reticular dermis. Below this is the subcutaneous tissue, consisting mostly of fat cells. The epithelium consists of the outer layer of skin. Extending from the surface of the epidermis to the dermis is a number of pores lined with epithelial cells. These pores make up oil glands, sweat glands, and hair follicles. These pores are tubular in shape but appear in cross-section in the diagram. If one looks at the back of the hand, one can understand how tiny and how many of these pores exist. These structures are important sources of epithelium to resurface an open wound. This basic anatomy of skin provides the knowledge of how skin can resurface an open wound. Enlarging the diagram of the epidermis, the individual cells that make up the epidermis layer are called epithelial cells. These cells appear as cubes along the basement membrane where they are attached and where they originate. As these cells move towards the surface of the skin, these cells become flat and lose the nucleus of the cell. These flat cells are stacked upon each other. The technical name in histological terms is stratified squamous epithelial cells. The outer layer of epithelial cells will slough off. This is a process of exfoliation. The integrity of the cells can be broken in any number of ways, and the epithelial cells will migrate from these different sources of epithelial cells depending upon the type of injury. So let's look at different types of wounds and the ways epithelium can migrate to cover an open wound. In lacerations, let's say a surgical incision, the epithelium migrates across the width of the laceration until the epithelium from one side contacts the epithelium from the other side and stops migration. This is called contact inhibition. Since the width of the surgical incision is very small with the use of well-placed sutures, the process of epithelialization, movement of epithelial cells across the laceration site, occurs very rapidly. This is the easiest closure of a wound that is not complicated. Let's complicate the wound. Let's say the wound is now a burn, a superficial second-degree burn. How does epithelialization proceed? The first diagram is unburned skin. Notice the hair follicle, oil glands, and sweat gland extending into the dermis. Now, if a superficial second-degree burn happens, the epidermis and part of the dermis is destroyed. The diagram on the right illustrates this. There are epithelial cells of the epidermis at the edge of the wound and epithelial cells lining the hair follicle, oil gland, and sweat gland. The cells that make up the migrating epithelium originate from the basement membrane cells adjacent to the burned skin areas and from epithelial cells that make up the oil glands, sweat glands, and hair follicles are located in the deeper layers of the skin's dermis below the burned area. Remember, these pores can extend to the deep dermis, the reticular dermis, of the skin, but most of these glands extend into the papillary dermis. These epithelial cells in oil glands, sweat glands, and hair follicles are especially important in this example of a burn victim. These epithelial cells form a tubular structure below the skin and they migrate upward to the surface. The circumferential upward migration then spreads over the exposed dermis. The surface appearance of migrating epithelial cells can be seen to a trained eye as tiny circles of skin which can reflect fluorescent light. These circles continue to migrate until they reach other circles of migrating epithelial cells. Then migration stops due to contact inhibition. Let's complicate the wound situation further. Let's say a deep wound causes the loss of the entire skin and the deeper tissues. The normal skin diagram is located in the upper right. In a deep wound, the epidermis, dermis, and part of the subcutaneous tissue are gone. This could be from a very deep burn or from an avulsion injury from a motorcycle accident or any other serious injury. In this situation, the epithelium migrates from the periphery of the wound because the epithelium lining the oil gland, sweat glands, and hair follicles do not exist in the dermis as the dermis is now gone. If the wound is allowed to resurface from the periphery, then this wound will close over a very long time. Surgeons have better ways to close such wounds, which allow better results in less time. In most cases, it is preferable to skin graft the wound if such a long distance must be traversed by the migrating epithelial cells. However, this is the decision of the physician directing the care because it also involves many other considerations. Remember from the previous lesson, the wound will form granulation tissue in the base, which will make the depth of the wound shallower. The epithelium then migrates over the granulation tissue. Contact inhibition stops further migration. This will be understood clinically because there will be very little or no drainage from the wound. Also, dressings will not stick to the wound any longer. The epithelial cells then actively divide to form multiple layers of epithelium as seen in normal skin histology. Remember, wound healing is a dynamic process with multiple things going on at the same time. Bleeding stops, granulation tissue forms, cells are migrating, and the wound will contract, which is the topic of our next lesson. Thanks.